Hi, welcome to Board Gems. Welcome to my weekly video series in which I cover an older board game that I happen to think is a gem. And I'm not always right. And probably a lot of them I'm wrong, but it's my opinion. And some of these games that I cover, the hobby has moved on from, and a lot of people don't think they're actually very good games, but they happen to fit me for whatever reason, and I just don't want people to forget about them because I think they're really good games. And they're still great games today. I sometimes cover these older games that have kind of low-ish ratings on Board Game Geek. One of them was, for example, Baker Street, which has something like a 5.6 out of 10 on Board Game Geek, but I think is a really charming little game. The ratings for this one are pretty low also. They're like 6.2 out of 10, and you're not going to see a lot of people saying wonderful things about this game anymore, but when I played it for the first time, I was just charmed by it. It's a perfect sort of game for me, and that is Strada. Now, Strada was designed by Martin Wallace and was published by Kosmos back, I think, in 2004. The box says ages 10 and up. 8 and ups could play, but keep in mind that once you set up the board, there's no more randomness. So it is very possible for people who don't really understand what's going on to fall behind in this game. And it's a really short game. The box says 30 minutes. You could play a game in 20 minutes tops. Like 30 minutes maybe if everybody's thinking really hard, but you can breeze through a game in 20 minutes. And the box says 2 to 4 players. It's a 3 or 4 player game. The rules inside include a 2-player variant that doesn't seem to be very good. I consider this a 3 or 4 player game only, but at that player range, I love it. So why don't I show you how it plays, and then I'll talk more about why, for me, it's a gem. To set up the game, set up the frame here, just like this. And there are these sort of dog bone shaped pieces that go in here. Just hold off on those for now, because the inside frame is a bit of a tight fit. There's 6 of these tiles, one of which has a little extra hex on the end. So you can put that anywhere, just kind of on one side like that, such that this piece is in the middle. And then the other 5, you are going to shuffle up, and you can change directions to like something like this, and then lay them out in a circle. And now you can put in the dog bone connectors. If you have a problem pushing them in like that, it's actually much easier to just put them face down, although it doesn't look great. We're going to set up for a 3-player game, yellow, black, and gray. Each player will get all the cubes, I think it's about 12 cubes of their color, along with a little shield which will mark how many resources they have. Resources range from 0 to 10, and each player is going to start with 0. Each player will also get 1 workshop of their color. So let's put that next to the players for now. These are the city tiles. There's 4 different sizes of city. The smallest are the hamlets. Then we have villages, towns, and cities. Sometimes it can be a little tricky to tell the difference, so just note like the cities are very red and they take up most of the tile. These are the big ones. This, for example, is the village. That's the second one down here. The colors are also a tiny bit off. Anyway, what you're going to do is you're going to mix these up. You can flip all these face down and mix them up and place 1 face up on each space marked with a gray dot. And this is kind of optional. I like to have the cities not necessarily too close together, so sometimes what I'll do is I'll kind of switch them around a little bit like that, just create a little bit of space. Now determine a start player. In the rules, the start player is going to be first to place their workshop somewhere on the board, then the others will go in clockwise order, and then the start player will be the first to play. And I do find that there's a bit of a start player advantage. Now, I'm not much of a game designer. You could probably balance it by having having some of the later players start with a little more resources. But one thing that worked for us is that determine a start player, we'll say it's gray. Starting with the player to the start player's right, so in this case yellow, yellow will be first to put down their workshop, and then you go counterclockwise, and the start player will be last to place their workshop, which is the starting location for them, and then they take the first turn. So even though they'll take the first turn, they're last to put down their starting location. Maybe the other players can find a better spot. So I'll just do that right now. So the only rule is that the workshops must be placed on plain grass. And finally, each player gets all the road tiles of a single color. Now the player color is represented as the path, the road on the tile. And so there's grassy tiles, which have straight road on one side and a curve on the other. All the tiles are like that, but there's grass, there's forest, and there's hills. As you can see, the road colors are different for the different colored players. What players are trying to do is build roads to connect their workshop to the cities on the board. Anytime they can build a road that goes directly from their workshop into one of the town tiles, they get to put one of their cubes in there. At the end of the game, each cube will score a player points based not only on the size of the city, but also how many other players are in there. So if I can show you an example, this is a village. And on the top spaces, it shows number of cubes, and on the bottom, it shows gold coins, which are the points in the game. So if gray builds to a village, for example, that's not going to work. So if gray builds to a village, they would put one gray cube in there. If at the end of the game that's the only cube in that village, this cube would go into here, where there shows, you see it shows one cube. This is going to score gray 3 points. However, it's a 3-player game. Let's say all 3 players manage to connect this village to their workshops. Then in the end, you will put all these cubes into this box that shows 3 cubes, and each cube will score its owner 1 point. So it's not only about connecting to the bigger cities, although that definitely is a good thing, but it also can be worthwhile to connect to smaller towns where you don't have a lot of competition. So on a player's turn, a couple things happen. First, they gain 6 resources. Resources are going to be spent to build roads. Now you always get 6 up to a maximum of 10. So if you already had 6, if gray did nothing on their turn, then when their turn came around again, they would gain 6, but it would top out at 10. And then you build roads. You don't have to, you could pass. Building roads, each road costs 2 resources if you build it in a grass area, 3 if you build it on a forest, and 4 if you build it on a hill. So if this player were to connect to this hamlet, they could do that. For example, you place the same type tile, so a hill tile on a hill space, like that. Building past it is not enough. The road has to go in it, into the hamlet. That would cost 4, so they're down to 2. They could put a cube in there, right? And then maybe they could also do this, for example. That costs 2. So there you go, because that's on grass, and they get to put a cube in here as well. Now this hamlet is next to their workshop, but it's not connected. You still need a road to go in. And you'll note there are no sharp turns. There's only straight lines and gradual turns. Each space can only have 1 tile in it. Now note, you can't just build a path going nowhere. You have to be able to complete the road. And a road is always from your workshop to one of the town tiles, or from one of the town tiles you've already connected, so it already has your cube in it, to another town tile. So if this is what the player does on their first turn, I mean later on they could build to this hamlet, for example, by spending 3. They're building from this town to another town. And of course, they don't have to take the most direct route. That costs 3, but it could cost 4 to do something like this. And that can become important if other players are nearby and you kind of want to block them from getting into some of the good towns. But it's very important. If you can't complete the road, you don't even start it. There is no limit to the number of players that can be in a single town, but each player can only be in a town once with one of their cubes. Roads cannot cross each other, so blocking is a huge part of this game. And note, sometimes based on the random setup, some of these town tiles can be adjacent to each other. If black, for example, were to connect to this city, they are not automatically connected to this village. They would have to build separately to that one, and they could do it like that, for example. Players also can't build to connect to each other's workshop. So over the course of the game, players' road networks are going to grow and connect to all sorts of different cities. So what I'm going to do, so you can see how it works, is I'm going to play through the game, just by myself, 3-player game by myself, and I'll show you what the game may look like at the end. The game will end when one player on their turn is not able to connect to a new city. But you only check at the start of a player's turn. So if a player runs out of cubes at the end of their turn, it is important that that player say so and say, I'm out of cubes, so everybody knows this next turn is going to be their last turn. Okay, here's the end of a sample 3-player game. Gray started, and Gray was the first to use up all their cubes. So each player had one more turn, and then it comes back to Gray. Gray has no cubes at the start of their turn, so the game is over. And now we score. Keep the resource markers where they are. That's a tiebreaker. So to score, pick up all the cubes in a single city and place them in the matching space, matching that city size, for the number of cubes there. So this town, this is a town, has 2 cubes, so they will go in there. And you'll do that for every city and town and village and so on. And then we total up the points. To keep score, what I like to do is to use cubes and put them here. And then as you get points, move the cubes up there. When the cube reaches 10, just get another cube and continue like that. Track points that way. Every cube you pull out is going to score its owner the number of points equal to the number of coins in that box. So this is going to score Gray 6 points. It's very possible I did my math wrong, but it's looking like it's a tie between Gray and Black. And so based on that, that's the score. The player with the highest score wins. In the case of a tie, it's number of resources remaining. It's almost like a 0.2 score, for example. That's it. You're ready to play La Strada. In an earlier video, I covered a game called Tinner's Trail, which is by the same designer as this game, a guy by the name of Martin Wallace. And he has a particular style of game. And I said something about Tinner's Trail. Let's cut back to that tape. It's not really all that complicated to learn. It's one of the lighter Wallace games. Now, I want to stress, though, that it is a Wallace game. So it's interesting, right? I call Tinner's Trail one of the lighter Wallaces. It's got nothing on this. This is probably the lightest Martin Wallace game, more or less, that you could find. And whereas that game, even though it's kind of lighter for a Martin Wallace game, it still feels like a Martin Wallace game. This one feels like something completely different. This is a much simpler and more straightforward game than most of anything Martin Wallace puts out. It doesn't even feel like a Martin Wallace game. It feels like a really simple, straightforward 3 or 4 player game with very little randomness, except for the randomness when you set up the board, and everything else is controlled by the players. But it still very light, very approachable. In fact, I'd almost go so far as to say that for a lot of hobbyists, this game probably doesn't do enough to satisfy a hobbyist. A hobbyist may approach this game and play it, and it's over in 20 minutes, and they go, "Oh, that's it." Maybe it could have used something more. I don't know. But for what it is, it's great. It's just a super simple, really nice flowing game. It has such a great little flow. And to play a game, no luck except for initial setup, but still feels like a board game. It still has a little bit of strategy, and it's over in 20 minutes. It's just great. Now, the ratings for this game are really low. 6.2 on Board Game Geek. That is, in my opinion, for two reasons. One is that the game comes with a two-player way to play. So the box says 2 to 4 players. Let me say something here. If you say your game will play 2 players, it should better play 2 players, okay? There are people who will buy a game for 2 to 4 and mostly play it 2-player. And so the game has to work with 2 players. And unfortunately, this game, the 2-player mode feels kind of tacked on. It's really a 3 or 4-player game. But at that player range, it's great. 3 players is a little bit wide open, so you can kind of do what you want. It's kind of easygoing. 4-player, much more tight, much more, the board seems much more restrictive. So it's almost a Goldilocks game. Now, a Goldilocks game is a game that, it's a term I use to describe a game that has a player range and doesn't really scale. It doesn't scale the board for different player counts. So a 3-player game would feel much more open than, say, a 5-player game, right? This is like a condensed Goldilocks game, because at 3 players, it's pretty wide open, and at 4 players, there's lots and lots of blocking and getting in each other's way. So the ideal count, I would guess, would probably be 3.5 players. So if you know a player who's just half a person, yeah, no, cut that out. But yeah, the 2-player game, at least what's included in the box, is not worth looking at. But as a 3 or 4-player game, in my opinion, it's great. But still, people play it 2-player and they don't like it, and so they give it a bad rating. That's fair. And the second reason, which is really surprising considering what a great designer Martin Wallace is, although this is a little bit of an early game of his, 2004-ish is fairly early, the start player has a really big advantage. So what happens is that the start player is the first person to put down their workshop, so they can pick the best location, and they're also the first person to build roads. And the player order never changes. It just seems like a weird thing to miss. I'm not convinced that it was missed, other than the designer or the publisher, one of the two, Wallace or Kosmos, decided to keep the rules as super simple as possible, so they left out things that otherwise would be, you know, maybe little extra rules or little extra considerations that you can use to balance the game. You know what, if you're playing in a family setting, you know, with a mix of kids and adults, don't have to worry about it. Just have the kids go before the adults, and that's fine. But for hobbyists, you need to do something about the start player. Now, what we do in our home, is we do kind of reverse order for placing the workshops. So the start player is the first person to put down roads, but starting with the last player in turn order and going counterclockwise, everybody puts down their workshops. So the last player to put down the workshop is the first player to put down roads. That helps a lot. I'm not sure it's enough, but it works well enough for our purposes. The other thing, which I'm not really qualified to comment on, is that because every player at the start of their turn starts with 6 resources, you could set it up, and I think this was actually suggested in some gaming magazines way back around the time this was released, like the early to mid 2000s, is have the players later in turn order start with an extra resource. So first player will start with 0 and then on their first turn get 6, but the second player could start with 1 and then get 6 on their first turn, and the third player could get 2, and if there's a fourth player, they could get 3. That could work as well. I haven't tried that personally. So those are both two kind of serious issues, right? A 2 to 4 player game that doesn't work really well with 2, and a big star player advantage. So I'm not surprised that the ratings for this are fairly low. Maybe I'm just the type of person that I want to see the game at its best, right? So when I read the rules, I'm like, oh, I don't want to even try this 2-player, right? So I went directly to the 3 and 4-player game, and then I did notice a start player problem, and we figured out a way to work around it. I'm not against variance, and you shouldn't be either. Look, I'm all in favor of playing the game as the rules intend, but at the same time, feel free to make a game work for you. And so if you find that the start player advantage is not a problem, for example, you play with kids and adults and always have the kids go first, totally fine, don't worry about it. Play by what's in the rules. But if you're playing with other hobbyists or you take those sorts of balance issues seriously, consider one of those 2 options. Anyway, I happen to really like this game at the 3 and 4-player counts. I like it at both counts. 3 players, of course, it is more wide open, but it's more opportunity to do things, and there's a little bit more opportunity to strategize. And the only strategy in this game really is deciding where to connect when. And timing is a big part of this game, because every round you start with 6 resources plus up to 4 resources that you may have had from the previous turn. So you could do very little on your turn, bank some resources, and then have a bigger turn next round. Maybe you want to make a big turn. Maybe you want to get to that city, but you'll need like 9 resources to get there. So on your previous turn, you'll just do very little and bank some resources. Keep 3 of them so that next turn you'll get 6, you'll have 9, and you can make the big play. But by doing very little on your turn, the game is really short, right? You can play it in 20 minutes. It's a super short game. And by passing, or effectively passing, or doing very little on a turn to trying to bank stuff for the big turn that you want to do, of course the other players will be doing stuff too. And you can easily fall behind. So there's really interesting kind of decisions there in terms of what to prioritize, right? At the beginning of the game, everybody's just kind of connecting to close by stuff, right? But as their network grows, there are real decisions in terms of where to connect next, because you'll always be connecting from workshop to town or town to town. So obviously at the beginning, you'll connect to a bunch of close by towns, but then afterwards you have to focus. Do I focus over here or down here? And that's a really interesting decision because, of course, it also depends on the other players. So you may want to prioritize getting your roads in there. And, of course, building them in the ideal places. Of course, you know, you want to build in grass instead of forest instead of hills. The cost comes into play. And, you know, the first person to be able to build will obviously take the most ideal and cheapest route to get there. But not necessarily. They could also spend a little bit more, build kind of a more wide route, kind of a more exaggerated route. Why? Just to cut people off. It's that kind of game. You're blocking people left and right, especially in a 4-player game. That's a big, big thing. Now, it can mean that sometimes a player will get locked out kind of early, and they kind of, you know, but it's just such a short game. Who cares, right? You know, it's a learning experience. First game is a learning experience. Play again. And, you know, there's room to improve. But it kind of peaks early. Like, after you play the game a couple times, you're probably going to see pretty much everything there is in the game. But I still find the decisions while you play to be interesting. What I ask myself is like, well, does it run on rails? No, because you could easily lose by making bad decisions. So it's not obvious, and especially in terms of prioritizing and that timing. For example, at the end of the game, maybe the only towns you can reach are pretty far away, so you have to bank resources. But if you don't time it right, you still need a couple of close-by towns to connect to use up a little bit of the resources because you can't bank everything. So imagine if you get 6 resources, so you have 6, and there's a city you want to get to and it's 9 away, but there's nowhere you can connect to now. So you pass, next turn you'll get 4, you've just lost 2 resources because you could only carry forward 4 of the 6 resources you got last round. So the timing can be really important, right? You want to kind of balance connecting, like in the beginning, it's short term, right? Just connect to what you can really, really close by. Connect to big stuff, connect to close stuff. Mid to late in the game, you're really kind of trying to balance connecting to some close by things, which are easy and can use up a little bit of resources, so that you can just use enough that you'll have some to bank for the big turns, which you're going to need later in the game. You know what? Minor thing, but the fact that so much game, for me, is packed into such small a time frame is great. Now, this game is not going to be for everyone. It is rated 6.2 on Board Game Geek, which means probably most people don't agree with me. So I mentioned 2 reasons. A third one, at least for today's standards, this game is going to look rather boring and drab. My son really complained about the look of the Strada. If you're the type that you think you might find this game boring, the look of the game isn't going to help you. It looks as boring as you would probably find it to be. I mean, I think it's perfectly clear. It's a little bit confusing. You have to learn the different sizes of the towns. So there's the hamlet and the village and the town and the city, and they all look a little bit different. But at an initial glance, it can be a little bit hard to differentiate them. You kind of have to learn it. And it's easy to learn, but it means, you want to play it a couple times, and then you kind of internalize that. But look, it's perfectly reasonable to not like this game. And it seems like most people would think it's just certainly now. I think a hobbyist looking at this game now would be like, oh my god, there's something missing. Like, it needs more. Maybe special powers or a hand of cards to do wacky things. And this is a type of game that you really don't see much of anymore. Super short, a little bit thinky, very little randomness. It's a filler, but it's a thinky filler. And I use the word thinky a lot. Look, this game, maybe it's wrong to say this game is super, super thinky. It's not. It's not that thinky. But my point is there's no randomness except for the initial setup. Everything else is controlled by the player. So you can think it out if you want to, right? If I do this, what are the other players going to do? Well, they'll probably go there, actually I'll do this instead. And I guess that could suffer a little bit from analysis paralysis, but the game is so breezy, right? It just flows, and like I said, it's over in 20 minutes. It's just so fast. I was surprised how good this game is for me. I do want to caution people, because I know there are some people who watch these videos and they say, oh, sounds great, I'll go out and buy a copy. And it's like, please don't. The whole point of me doing these videos is to highlight older games that a lot of people maybe think aren't that great, but I happen to think are really good. And I'm in the minority for a lot of these. So don't rush out and buy this. But you know what, if you happen to see it used, consider it. It's not as bad as maybe some of the hobby hive mind would have you think. If you do decide to pick it up though, it is really easy to get used. You can buy copies used on the Board Game Geek marketplace for something like $10 US, really cheap, and there's lots of people willing to trade their copies away. I'm not going to trade my copy away. This is really my type of game, and it's not going to be for everyone, so don't rush out and get it. But if you happen to see it in a trade, just remember, like, oh yeah, that Strada it's apparently not that bad a game. Daryl said so. Maybe I'll give it a try. And maybe, just maybe, you'll like it as much as I do. Thanks for watching. Remember, older games like La Strada don't stop being good just because new games come out. Take care.